Bloody Roots. Reverend Ian Christie is about to begin. Bloody Roots. Please turn to page 666. From the pages of Hound of the Beast, your weekly heavy metal history lesson with Ian Christie.
That's right. This is Ian Christie. Welcome to Roots of 1999. The year metal was nearly broken. From 20 years ago, the lowest point of metal's popularity, grooves, samples, industrial textures, and ultimately, salvation. A story told today in music by Machine Head, Megadeth, Slipknot, Grip Inc., Neurosis, Control Denied, Typo Negative Emperor, Opeth, and at this point, thrash metal veterans crashing up against the rock in the mid-1990s, finding hope in a life preserver in 1999 with the addition of drummer Dave Lombardo of Slayer. It's 1999 again. The way forward is foggy and unclear. Yet, all hope is not lost. From The Gathering, it's Testament, Eyes of Wrath. I'm Ian Christie, SiriusXM. Yeah, a good stable 1999 metal track with a typical ear-boggling drum performance by the great Dave Lombardo. Testament after wandering through the 1990s for a while, going under the name Dogface Gods, seeing the departure of long-term main characters like Alex Skolnick and Greg Christian, attempting to delve into the darker depths with the Demonic and Low albums in the 1990s, coming out on the other end, kind of holding it together in 1999 with this, like, let's do what we know best and see what happens next. Hi, I'm Ian Christie. This is Roots of 1999, the year metal almost broke. And I don't mean broke into the mainstream. I mean broke apart completely. This is your weekly metal history lesson, Roots. And each and every week, we look at a different time period in metal, a different key figure, a different country. We get to the bottom of the many different aspects that make all of this metal stuff so fascinating. I'm the author of the book Sound of the Beast, A Complete Headbanging History of Heavy Metal, and publisher of many other staples of any metal household, all available at bazillionpoints.com. 1999 is a year that, by this point, all hope seemed to be really ebbing for the future of metal music. At this point, the stuff had been around for 30 years. It had enjoyed cult notoriety, diehard devotion, huge, massive mainstream success, and then had somewhat been declared outmoded. The so-called rock star attitudes, the flourishes, the over-the-top images of the 80s, the guitar solos, and all of these things were seen in the 1990s as things to be embarrassed by. Lots of sensitivity on display, and it was difficult for heavy metal to navigate through these waters. And it's a little bit hard, honestly, to put together a playlist for 1999 that's actually listenable, because there are so many doldrums, so many down points, and so many bands that probably would rather forget this era of their careers. But, you know, with a lot of good late night listening leading up to this week's show, it is definitely a year with musical excursions like Megadeth doing industrial music. That's not something that the world was clamoring for in 1986. But you know what? It came out, and it's in the past, and we can listen to it now and say, that's what 1999 was. It's also a year of great revelations. We have Emperor in full swing, the arrival of Opeth, opening the door to what metal would become in the next 20 years. You got to look at this like long-term graph of metal's popularity, success, and pull, and 1999 is really the low point. Just for perspective, I can say, just looking at shows in the New York area around 1998-99, Slayer played in Irving Plaza. That's a capacity of about 600 people. You know, currently, on their farewell tour, they were playing to about 15,000 a night. Iron Maiden played in New York City in Hammerstein Ballroom in 1999. That's a capacity of about 2,000 people. They usually these days don't get out of bed for less than 20,000 people. It's not unusual on an Iron Maiden tour to see 50 to 70,000. Morbid Angel, a band that was playing to thousands in the early 1990s, playing small clubs, 200 people, 300 people in 1999. Even Judas Priest playing like 1,500 people. And again, they're now headlining in America, 15 to 20,000 people a show. Crazy, crazy situation when you look back on it. You have to feel that these musicians that we're hearing today felt like it almost didn't matter what they did as long as they could get a record out, keep doing what they're doing. But there wasn't a big feeling that this was snowballing into something bigger and bigger. We can look back now comfortably and say, well, you know what? The way things turned out, it's kind of okay. But in 1999, this is a time when the mainstream media was gone for metal. The big record labels didn't support it any longer. The MTV playlist no longer featured metal bands. The one exception to all of that is a big influence on today's show, though, especially these next block of songs. You have to look at the new metal phenomenon. Korn, out of Bakersfield, California, releasing in 1999 their fourth album, Issues, a multi-platinum album on the heels of several multi-platinum albums, including especially the 1998 record Follow the Leader, quintuple platinum album. And the success of this groove-oriented, rap-infested, basically like aggressive rap music played on actual instruments, it fell like a comet into the middle of heavy metal. You had bands like Sepultura leaning in the Korn direction, great innovators in their own right, seeing what they could do and take and run with the Korn sound. Of course, Max Cavalera leaving that band and forming his very Korn-influenced Soulfly, who debuted in 1998. And looking at the lineups of Ozfests in 1998-99, dominated by Korn-style nu metal bands. Which isn't to say I'm about to play a Korn song. I don't even have to. We have bands like Machine Head doing the work for us here, and Slipknot in a couple of minutes from their official debut album, 1999's self-titled Slipknot album. And already in that case, I think you can see something more metallic coming out of the nu metal phenomenon, a way forward. One last idea to float in your head before we finally get into some music. Well, in the 1990s, if you look at some of the biggest bands, the biggest names, right? These explosive big hits by Faith No More, White Zombie, maybe you could say Helmet, even Marilyn Manson if you want to go that far. It's all on the fringes. It's all experimental. This isn't meat and potatoes, Iron Maiden style, Candlemass style, Black Sabbath style metal. It's something that knows about all of those bands, but does it all in a different, fringy, alternative, moody kind of way. By 1999, I feel like the experiments were no longer just experiments. I mean, the bands were seriously adrift at this point. Song from Megadeth's Risk in about 10 minutes, a great example of that. There's no attempt to hold on to the metal bass because by 1999, the metal bass, it seems, dissipated, even though it's about ready to start crawling back and become as big as it ever was. All right, Machine Head here from their highly nu metal influenced album, The Burning Red, Slipknot from their debut, Megadeth from the Risk album, and then more of Dave Lombardo's drumming from his highly mechanical, industrial influenced late 1990s band, Grip Inc. I'm Ian Christie. This is Roots, your weekly metal history lesson, as we visit the year 1999, the year metal was nearly broken.
lesson with Ian Christie. Bloody Roots. Liquid Metal! From the pages of your heavy metal history lesson. Bloody Roots. Liquid Metal!
Endless are the window patrols. Time wags its accusing finger. Time will cut you without distinction in the 11th hour. Cracked up high! Cracked up high! Tides, chewing skin and dead blades, ringed by broken cars and guns, nocturnal hiding from the sun, teeth turn black and rot. You don't want it, you just need it, you gotta get it, cracked up really Into the third day, men leper, disorientated, fighting hard to feed, retracing steps of lost weekends, habit feeding habit, without distinction of the 11th hour.
Yeah, another track there featuring Dave Lombardo on the drums. Slayer, even at this point, influenced by the groove metal phenomenon. Didn't release anything in 1999, so not part of this show, but just worthy of commentary as we're talking about what's going on in 1999, 20 years ago, when the initial, the mountain had been climbed. Heavy metal won. Every person alive in the 1980s was affected in some way. That feeling carried on into the 1990s, but during the first half of the decade began to get more dissipated. You had people branching off, getting more extreme into the death metal side of things. You had newcomers coming in, never really aware of Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, just listening to the new metal bands, to Roots era Sepultura, to later on to Soulfly, to Korn, to Machine Head during this period. And by 1999, definitely a feeling in the air, this metal thing had run its course. And I don't mean to cast a negative light on what bands like Megadeth, or in a second we'll hear Chuck Schuldiner in his more traditional but progressive metal band Control Denied. These guys felt free in a way, without the huge commercial pressure, to kind of pursue a kind of music that they wouldn't have been able to do at the height of their success. In 1992, nobody was going to let Megadeth get away with an industrial track. Nobody was going to let death metal godfather Chuck Schuldiner have clean vocals and, 9-minute long kind of clean-sounding traditional metal songs. So there's a little bit of artistic freedom that comes with the feeling that the world is no longer... The pressure is off, for good and for bad. But also out of that 1990s alternative explosion, there was room for a band like Type O Negative out of New York City. And if you could say Pantera was the band that took all the jettisoned traditional 1980s elements and clung to them for dear life and became like, the lightning rod for traditional big concert hall spectacles, lighters in the air during cemetery gates, the whole like experience of 1980s heavy metal. Their friends and counterparts, Typo Negative, were quite the opposite, really, playing like keyboard music, very gloomy, lots of dark, sardonic humor, self-deprecating, but doing it in a very metal way. This wasn't Korn or Pearl Jam crying about emotional problems. This was like dark humor based very much on metal. And, for that reason, also a massive lightning rod for metal in the 1990s. And hey, there are a bunch of you right now listening who are alive and kicking in the 1990s who say, what's the big fuss? On the black metal underground, it was a banner time. That was the best decade. Month after month, brand new releases coming out of South America, Norway, Europe, England, the United States. There was so much activity and energy in underground metal at this time. We have a track coming up off the second to last Emperor album in just a couple of minutes, released in 1999. And look at the decade, one of the finest metal bands of all time, entering the decade as in their young teens, becoming a demo band, touring England, becoming swept up in a wave of sensational crime and violence in Norway, surviving all of that, even with members imprisoned, to ultimately produce some of the most like imaginative and inspired metal of all time. Some music by the great Emperor in a couple of minutes. Also important to note, 1999, just about their peak year as they were really on their way out the door, on the way to breaking up within 2 years' time. Another side of things would be, I have to play something by Neurosis from the Times of Grace record, a huge cult band during the 1990s, touring with a massive, almost circus-like spectacle, films being projected, huge, long, massive-sounding songs, and to me, entirely a product of the 1990s, with absolutely zero mainstream attention, and still to this day, absolute legends in metal. So yeah, 1999, it felt like a lot of big ships were running adrift, like the water was being drained out of the metal ocean, and yet, crawling up from the sludge, hope was not lost. Neurosis, Typo Negative, and the mighty Emperor in a few minutes' time. This is Control Denied. Chuck Schuldiner leaving death metal and his band Death behind to pursue, in the last years of his life, the music he wanted to make. I'm Ian Christie. It's Roots of 1999, the year metal was almost broken.
When life seems to be
from the pages of Sound of the Beast, your weekly heavy metal history lesson with Ian Christie. Liquid Metal!
Emperor off 9 Equilibrium from 1999. Hard to imagine that this is considered a low point in metal's history. But yeah, looking at the box offices, looking at the attention given by the world to metal, it was really a time when metal was about as hiding in the nooks and crannies as it ever has. Hope you've enjoyed today's musical history lesson. I tried to make it not too torturous. It's a little bit hard to look back at a tough year like 1999 and come up with an enjoyable playlist, but in this case, interesting stuff, you know. Sometimes this is metal history, after all. In the great big picture of things, you can't appreciate the highs without the lows, right? 1999 is the year that I started writing Sound of the Beast, the complete headbanging history of heavy metal, largely inspired by feeling like there was a need to document 30 years of metal evolution, that this metal history that started with Sabbath in 1970 was being swept under the rug and being overlooked. And there were so many tens of thousands of bands at that point and millions of listeners who had dedicated so much energy and so much of their life that it would actually be a crime if the stuff wasn't documented in book form, available in bookstores everywhere. Well, 4 years later, I emerged from my writerly cocoon, schlepped over here to SiriusXM for the first time, back when we had like 30,000 listeners or whatever, and began doing weekly metal history lessons. And week by week during that time, we've just seen a rebuilding of momentum, familiar names from the past coming back to reign once again after being lost on the rocky shores of the late 1990s. But you have to kind of turn your head back to 1999, 20 years back, and look and say, you know, it's kind of interesting that these weird records came out from these bands at that time. It's cool that we have that to look back on and say, oh, this is how things could have turned out in an alternate reality that's not as good as ours. But still, you hope that the experimentalism that went into those albums out of necessity or out of desperation somehow still finds its way back into the living fluid of what pushes metal bands forward after decades of existence. Anyway, glad we made it back. Glad that this metal phenomenon has rebounded tremendously in the past 20 years, pushing now towards our 50th anniversary coming in 2020. If you were listening closely, you could hear the seeds of what became metal's more mature development in the 2000s with the music of Emperor and Neurosis. Longer songs, more willingness to experiment, a greater mastery of musical chops, and willingness to bring in non-metal elements with confidence that the metal core is burning hot enough to propel it all forward at super speed and super power. Thank you very much for joining me. Roots of 1999, the year metal was almost broken. Playlist resides at roots.bazillionpoints.com, and the Ultimate Metal Library lives forever at bazillionpoints.com. Visit me there for books like Murder in the Front Row, Sound of the Beast, Choosing Death, heavy metal movies, Metallica the Slayer Mag Diaries, Swedish death metal, Dirty Deeds, and many others. It's all at bazillionpoints.com, with pretty pictures going up all the time at Bazillion Points on Instagram. Leaving you now with a band from Sweden that developed throughout the 1990s and then walked right into this vacant open landscape of 1999, fully fledged, fully confident, and really broke open the 2000s in a major way. One of the dominating bands of the new millennium, the mighty Opeth. Thank you very much for joining me. Something here from Still Life. Finally, the world was ready for something of this epic, majestic, polished scale. It's The Moor on Roots. I'm glad we all survived 1999.
reason why I've
just heard Ian Christie's Bloody Roots, Liquid Metal's hour-long crash course in headbanger history.